afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Thunderbolt video number 3, which is all about the multiple choice section on the WHAP exam. First, let's go over some quick facts about the multiple choice section. In the multiple choice section of the exam, which is the first section, by the way, you will have 55 stimulus-based multiple choice questions, and you have 55 minutes to answer those 55 questions. That breaks down to 1 minute per question. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what on earth is a stimulus? A stimulus could be one of several things. It might be a short passage. It might be a painting. It might be a political cartoon. It might be a chart. It might be a map. It could be any of those things. And you have to analyze that stimulus in order to answer multiple choice questions. In other words, the multiple choice section is not based on rote memorization. The multiple choice section is based on your ability to analyze the stimulus and to answer the questions that go with it. The multiple choice section of the exam is worth 40% of your overall score. That is a pretty substantial amount. Now, in order to pass the multiple choice section, you want to get an approximate 50% of those questions correct. You might want to aim for a little bit higher, but a 50% on the multiple choice section paired with you doing well on the written sections of the exam will suffice for you to get a passing score of a 3. So 50% is the passing threshold. That's why a 50% in AP World is a C. Because if 50% is a passing threshold on the AP World exam, then why am I going to give you an F for a 50% in the class? It doesn't make sense. So hopefully that makes more sense now. Now, as far as the material goes in the multiple choice section, the questions usually will not go past the Cold War, which ended in 1991. And the reason being is because the College Board knows that most teachers don't generally get past that because of the massive amount of information that we have to get through this year. So College Board is relatively fair in that sense. So if we only get through the Cold War, which we'll go through some of the more modern stuff and the more like modern developments that take place, but I really don't anticipate you seeing many, maybe a couple questions at most for material past the Cold War. So the multiple choice questions assess the 4 separate time periods that we go over in this class. The time period we are currently in is 1200 to 1450 CE, that first time period listed. So each question, more or less, approximately makes up for about 24 to 30% of the multiple choice portion of the exam. So that's something to keep in mind, that you don't want to pay more attention to one time period in comparison with the others. You want to devote an equal amount of time, devotion, and study to each of the time periods listed. Finally, again, you are not going to find any recall questions on the test. Like, you're not going to have a question that says, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? Was it 1776? Was it 1783? Was it 1789? Well, we all know the answer is 1776, but you're not going to have any questions like that in the multiple choice section. Again, your performance in the multiple choice section depends on your ability to analyze the stimulus that you're given. And we're going to go over a method on how to analyze a stimulus. Oh, my apologies. It looks like we have a little formatting issues on this slide, but it should still be okay. Now, in order to analyze a stimulus, either for the multiple choice section or the SAQ section or even the DBQ section, when we get to that, you want to use the method that I like to call HIPPY. It's nice and easy to remember. The H in HIPPY stands for historical context. So whatever stimulus you get, whether it's a painting, whether it's a passage, a chart, a map, or whatever it might be, you want to determine what the context of that stimulus is. And the way that you're going to do that is by determining the 4 W's. Who wrote the document? What was the purpose of it? Where Was it written? When was it written? Just basic information about that text or about that chart or about that map. The nice part is that in the multiple choice section, and actually in every section, you are given some general information about the stimulus. They kind of give it to you and they make it a little bit easier for you to figure out, well, what's the historical event being talked about here? I'm going to show you an example here in just a few minutes. The I in HIPPY stands for intended audience. In other words, we don't want to just know who the overall broad audience was. We want to know who was the stimulus actually intended for. So let's say you get a passage. You want to kind of take a few notes about who the author was. Anything that you might know about that author that will kind of help you out as far as figuring out who that intended audience was. The first P stands for purpose. Now, when you're trying to determine the purpose of a stimulus, what you want to think about is what was the author's overall goal when writing this document or making this map or painting this piece of work from the Renaissance, whatever it might be. You want to think about what the goal was. What was the original goal when the stimulus was created? The second P stands for point of view. Now, when you think of point of view, you want to think of kind of a fish looking through a lens. And we're all different types of fish, and therefore we all look through a different type of lens. We all see the world differently. So what you want to do for point of view is you want to think about who the author is, think about the author's gender, think about the author's job, think about the author's race, where the author comes from, the author's ethnicity, and then think about how those various factors might change your understanding of the document. For example, we are going to do some primary source analysis later on this year about the middle passage, which was the middle or second leg of the Atlantic slave trade. We're going to take a look at the middle passage through the lens of a ship captain. We're going to take a look through the lens of a ship doctor. We'll take a look through the lens of an actual slave. So we're going to take a look at different points of view and see how that changes our understanding of not just the document, but of the historical event at hand. Point of view is extremely important. We're going to practice with that a lot. And then finally, the last I in HIPPY stands for impact. The question you want to ask yourself is, what was the overall impact of this document that I'm reading? Like, let's say, I highly doubt this will happen, but let's say you get a passage from the Diary of Anne Frank. And you think about, well, what was the overall impact of the Diary of Anne Frank? How did it change history? Well, Anne Frank is a symbol for the millions of victims, especially child victims of the Holocaust, a calamity started by the Nazi Party. And it helps us to remember the sufferings of young people like Anne Frank and how genocide affects the world at large. So you really want to think about the overall impact of any stimulus that you're given. So next, I want to go over the types of wrong answer choices with you. There are several. The first type of wrong answer choices is the out of scope wrong answer choice. Now, this wrong answer choice might contain information that looks to be correct, but even though the facts might be correct, if it doesn't have anything to do with the question, that's a wrong answer. Another type of wrong answer is wrong time period. Again, the information in this answer might be correct, but it might not pertain to the particular time period at hand. Now, you're going to be given the time period in either the question or the stimulus will provide a date. You're going to be given a time period in some way, shape, or form. So if an answer choice is out of scope and doesn't belong to that time period, get rid of that answer. Another wrong answer type is an answer with extreme language. Answers that include terminology like always, or never, or all, or none, or completely. You really want to avoid these types of answer choices because they're almost always wrong. I know I'm using the word always there, but they really are. They're too extreme. They're not all inclusive of all facts that coincide with a certain historical event. So be really careful of those 3 types of wrong answer choices. There's another one that is not in here, and the last wrong answer choice is the answer that is inherently wrong. There are going to be those types of answer choices that are just completely incorrect. If you know it's wrong, get rid of it. Don't try to talk yourself into some kind of way that it might be right. And I know that you guys do this because you're perfectionists and you overanalyze just like me. So just be really careful with that. Do not talk yourself into determining a wrong answer choice to be correct. So a really useful strategy then is to use the eliminate 2. By doing this, you can get rid of 2 wrong answers almost right off the bat, immediately. Always eliminate those 2 wrong answers first, and then you're going to be left with 2 answers. Now, those 2 answers are going to appear to be correct, and this is where WHAP gets tricky. This is where College Board gets tricky, really, is that there's always going to be, well, not always, but usually there's going to be more than one answer that looks to be correct. But one of those answers will answer the question better than the other answer. So always go with the answer that best answers the question. And then finally, another useful strategy that you can use for multiple choice questions, read the questions before reading the passage. Like, you don't have to read them like insanely thoroughly, just kind of scan them over. That way you kind of know what you're looking for before you analyze the passage. And that is a great strategy because then you're not going through, information that is useless or that isn't going to help you. So that's something that you can try. And most students that do well on the AP exams for AP history classes use that strategy. So that's something to keep in mind. Let's take a look at an example of multiple choice questions. The stimulus included for this for the 2 questions that are coming up, this is a painting. Again, a stimulus might be a passage, it might be a painting, or a photograph even. It might be a chart, a map, a political cartoon. In this case, it's a painting. And the painting is called School of Athens, and it was created or painted by Raphael, who was a high Renaissance artist, and it was painted between 1509 and 1511. This is one of the most famous paintings that came out of the high Renaissance. Now, the first thing that you want to do, and this is something you're going to get better at over time, and you'll be able to do it in your head over time, but what you want to do for each of these stimuli is to do just a quick hippie analysis. So again, we have H, historical context. What is the big picture going on here? Well, we know the Renaissance is happening. The Renaissance focused on humanism, individual learning. We kind of harken back to Greek and Roman antiquity. We see those traditions at play here. So that's our historical context. Next up, our intended audience. Well, the intended audience for the School of Athens was mostly intellectual figures, people with money, or aristocratic figures. The papacy specifically, we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Purpose. Raphael's overall goal when he painted School of Athens was to show the prevalence of intellectualism during the high Renaissance in Rome. And that's really important because this painting really underscores everything that Renaissance thinkers and artists were trying to emphasize. Philosophy, hearkening back to antiquity or Greek and Roman tradition. So these are things that you want to keep in mind. Again, for the purpose, you want to think about what the artist or author's overall goal was when creating whatever the document was or the stimulus. Point of view. So this is where it gets a little tougher because for point of view, this really depends on your knowledge of history. So what do we know about Raphael? Raphael was one of the head architects in Rome during the Italian Renaissance. And he was actually appointed by the Pope to paint School of Athens. And we see a lot of commission type behavior that was carried out by the papacy. So Raphael's opinion of intellectualism is that knowledge should come from that of aristocratic Greek philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato, who are pictured in the center here. So these are just some things to think about, that the influence of the Pope may have determined how Raphael pictured and painted intellectuals in the School of Athens. So that's something to keep in mind. The overall impact of School of Athens, well, again, it is one of the most famous paintings of all time, and it's timeless, and it really demonstrates the prevalence and the new focus on secularism versus religious matters. The Italian Renaissance focused on worldly subjects and secular subjects, and especially focusing on like individualism. So we see kind of a shift away from the focus on religious context here. So that's step one. You want to do a very quick hippie analysis for each stimulus that you're provided. Now, again, you have 55 questions, 55 minutes, so you kind of have to move quickly. So what I would recommend doing is for each one, definitely figure out what the historical context of each stimulus is. Prioritize that if that's all you have time for. It's really useful, and you're going to see why here in just a minute. Let's take a look at a question that goes along with the School of Athens. So we are on slide 5. So the question states, which of the following artistic techniques is utilized in the painting? So again, this is not something that is blatantly obvious if your knowledge of history is lacking. So you really need to make sure that your knowledge of history is vast. So in this case, here are our answers. We see the use of the pyramid configuration. That is completely wrong. There is no use of triangular or pyramid style configuration here. We do see a linear perspective where everything kind of gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller in the distance. So that's something that we see, but we can get rid of A. And then egg yolks as a base for paints. Well, okay, but that was a technique used at the time, so that's something that we can kind of take into consideration. Painting on wet plaster or frescoes, that one we can kind of knock right out. Now, the answer between B and C, the better answer would be vanishing lines of perspective. Why is that the better answer? Because it provides depth of perspective, meaning that the painting is far more realistic than that of medieval paintings that preceded it. So again, when you're answering these multiple choice questions, look for those wrong answers, cross them right off. And then when you're left with two that look pretty good, pick the one that answers the question best. Linear perspective is one of those key characteristics that came from Italian Renaissance art. So using your knowledge of history to answer these questions is very important too. Let's take a look at another question. Which of the following is a philosophical change during this time that acts as context for the painting? Remember, context is big picture. So let's take a look. A says the increased use of secular or worldly and non-religious themes. That already looks really good. Let's take a look at the rest of the answers just for grins. The decline of pre-classical thought? Certainly not. We're actually seeing a hearkening back of classical Rome and Greek tradition coming back into play here. So B is just a wrong answer. The rise of a courtier class that espoused chivalric ideals. Yes, to a point, but we're not really seeing chivalry be emphasized here. If this was a painting of knights in the medieval era, kind of focusing on feudalism, that would be a fantastic answer, but it's not. So it's out of scope. So we can we've already crossed off B. Now we're crossing off C. Let's take a look at D. A decrease in Egyptian and Mesopotamian deities. I mean, yes, but again, it's totally out of scope. We don't see an emphasis on ancient Egypt or ancient Rome. We see School of Athens, which we're talking about classical Greece here. So again, D is completely out of scope and completely inapplicable to this question. So we are left with A. And the reason why the answer is A is because we know that at its core, the Renaissance, at least the Italian Renaissance, demonstrates a major shift from religious themes to secular or worldly themes. Now, interestingly enough, This painting includes 21 separate people, and we have Aristotle, we have Plato, Michelangelo, and actually, funnily enough, Raphael and Michelangelo, I know, like Ninja Turtle status, right? These two guys kind of had a rivalry going on. Nevertheless, Raphael was heavily influenced by Michelangelo's style, so he includes him in the painting out of respect. And Raphael even includes himself. But again, this painting really diverges from that medieval tradition by not focusing so much on religious themes. So that was our example. Let's take a look at some overall advice and strategies for the multiple choice section of the WHAP exam. Watch the clock. Whenever you're practicing, try not to give yourself, don't give yourself more than a minute to answer these questions because you want to be prepared for test day. When you are answering these questions, 1 minute per question. Don't go past that because then you're doing yourself a disservice. Another tip, scan the questions prior to reading the documents or the stimulus. You want to make sure that you kind of have an idea of what you're looking for. Don't read the questions heavily or in depth before reading the stimulus because you don't want to waste too much time, but you definitely want to see what you're looking for before you do a HIPPY analysis for the stimulus. Next, again, immediately eliminate those wrong answers. Don't talk yourself into making a wrong answer your answer choice. It's really easy to do that. Don't do it. Next, think about the time periods and think about context more than anything else. You probably won't have time to do a full-on HIPPY analysis for the stimulus. So if it were what I did actually when I took AP World in high school is I focused on context and I focused on point of view. Those are the two most important to focus on and they'll help you the most when you are analyzing the stimuli. And then finally, tackle the easier stimuli first. You do not have to go in order on the day of the WHAP exam. You can go from stimuli to stimuli to stimuli. You can go back and forth. Go with the ones that are easiest to you first. Go with the ones that you know. If you know about a lot about the French Revolution and you get a stimulus on the French Revolution, tackle that first because not only are you going to get the points if you know it really well, it's also going to give you the confidence you need when you go back to tackle those tougher questions. So that is the end of our presentation on the multiple choice section. I hope this is helpful for you. If you have any questions regarding the multiple choice section of our class or the WHAP exam, please let me know. All right, everyone, it's been a blast. I will see you next time.